thing, we always start with a little bit of music. This song was the song you heard was chosen by our guest host, Massive Attack. I'm digging this, Claude. You have to download that one. For those that don't know me, my name is Jacki Zehner, and I am in our She Place office here in Park City, Utah, which it's at a place called Kiln, which is a new co-working space in the Mountain States. And we love it here. For those not familiar with She Place is a network that's open to all women. So please, self-identifying women and some cool dudes. I guess we're open to that too, right, Maddie?
Oh, yeah.
So please, we'll have the link posted in the chat. And please join us if you like and subscribe to our newsletter. And if this is your first time meeting me, Claude, just give me 1 second. A little bit about my background. We've been doing these LinkedIn Lives associated with our She Money newsletters for a little bit now. And my background is I'm a former partner and managing director at Goldman Sachs. I left that career to focus on philanthropy for about a decade, with my primary activity being that of being co-founder of a global philanthropic network for women called Women Moving Millions. And I'm a writer, blogger, speaker, and I'm investor in funds and directly, and just excited about everything, using everything I can do to really create more access to resources for those that are often overlooked and underserved. And excited about this conversation we'll be having today. And if you're joining us not on the live event, but listening to the recording, thank you for joining us as well. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples whose unceded lands in which we are calling in from. Claude is calling in from New York City. I am calling in from Utah, here in the ancestral lands of the Ute tribal nation and the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation. It's a practice we are committed to be doing at She Place. So I'm so excited about the conversation today that I'm going to be having. You already see the gorgeous face of Claude Grunitzky, who is featured in my most recent She Money newsletter. This will be an opportunity in this conversation for the next hour to go deeper with Claude. So I hope you've had a chance to read the newsletter, but if you haven't, no problem. But we encourage you to pop over and read it as well. And Claude, it was beautiful and I love it so much. And thank you for that, everything.
Thank you, Jacki.
Responses. Feel free to post questions in the chat, by the way. I'm going to go over here. Oh, there it is already. Oh my gosh, I see so many people. Hello. Post questions, comments. I think you can even give us high fives. I have my little props too, by the way. I might be giving you some of those during the call, Claude.
Yes.
So let me introduce this amazing human to you all, who I am so blessed to know. So I'm going to read this. I'll mess this up, Claude. So Claude is a Tongolese-American serial entrepreneur. He is the CEO and managing partner of the Equity Alliance. Claude's previous ventures include Trace and True America, which were funded by Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs connection, go Goldman, thank you. We're connected that way too. And he's a graduate of London University and MIT. And Claude, I don't know if you know this, but my husband is an MIT-er too. So we'll have to chat about that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. He's an author and community builder, and passion is passion, which you're going to hear about today, for teaching and mentorship. So welcome, Claude. Thank you for joining and having this conversation with me today.
Thank you for having me, Jacki. I've been looking forward to this conversation. It's going to be fun and interesting, hopefully.
Yes, and feel free to direct me. I'm going to start prompting you with some questions, but we can also respond to what's going on in the chat and elsewhere. I think we have a lot of people joining us today. But I'd love to start, your background, I always want to start there. It's like, tell me a little bit more. Of course, we have the article, which people may or may not have read. So a little bit about your background, sort of, before we jump into Equity Alliance and what it is today, sort of a little bit more about your background and what led you to this new thing, which we're talking about, which is the launching of your new fund, Equity Alliance.
Well, thank you, Jacki, for making this happen. Actually, I really want to start by really commending you for all the efforts you make to really elevate people who are not necessarily ones who are elevated in the media, in the world of finance, and even in the world of philanthropy. So it's great that you're shining a light on people like me. Well, I came to America a bit more than 20 years ago because I'm one of those people who kind of are very proud of their hybrid identities. At this point, I carry three passports. The U.S. because I've been living in the U.S. for 20 years. I grew up in Paris. I was also a French citizen, but I was born and raised my early years in Togo. And that's where it all starts. Togo is a very small country in West Africa, east of Ghana, and it's the size of West Virginia. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And I found my way to New York because I had this passion for hip hop, and I turned that into a magazine. And that magazine, Trace Magazine, became a quite influential magazine in youth culture because we were documenting the subculture around hip hop and music and fashion and film and art and technology. And that ended up being a massive movement globally. And because I was at the heart of it, by the time I moved to New York, I was able to build a media business around that. And that business was struggling quite a bit in the beginning. We'll talk about it. And one of the reasons we struggled was because I just couldn't get any funding. I was funding this publication, this monthly publication out of pocket and just really trying to find a way to survive in this cutthroat world of media, New York media. And then eventually I was able to get funded by Goldman Sachs, who invested 15 million in my Series A for my company. And that was when my journey became more of a commercial journey around being more than just an underground magazine publisher and editor, but somebody who actually had ambitions to create a real media company that would actually influence a lot of people, not just in New York, but globally. So that was the first part of my journey.
Todd, what year was that about?
So that was in 2003 is when we got funded by Goldman, and I was able to sell that company in 2010. And for the past decade, I have been really doing things similar to you. I've been kind of working on philanthropic endeavors. I've been sitting on boards. I've been teaching and lecturing at MIT and Harvard. And I've been mentoring a lot of young entrepreneurs. I've been in angel investing. I've been supporting them and really doing pro bono work for a decade. And the Equity Alliance is actually the evolution of the work that I've been doing pretty much my entire adult life, because first as an entrepreneur and then as somebody who helped entrepreneurs, mostly women and people of color, the evolution came from the fact that I had built a relationship with Dick Parsons over a 15-year period. I met him when I was running my media company, and he was the biggest name in media at the time because he was the CEO of Time Warner back when it was the world's largest media company. And I had never met a Black man, let alone a Black man from Brooklyn, who rose to the stratosphere in the way that he did, certainly not in the media circles. And I just immediately just wanted to get to know him, and we clicked. We just, started establishing a relationship. And then he called me about a year ago, said, you know what, it's time we finally did something together. And that's when we launched the Equity Alliance.
Well, oh gosh, I want to dig into those years in media. And I'm actually thinking about it, which I haven't told you yet, we're thinking about launching a magazine, which feels so, early 2000s. But
yeah,
the fact that you had this background, and I like, the parallel that you're drawing is, absolutely appreciated and true. Like you have some level of success, and then you say, I want to, you kind of lean in or look back and say, what are the barriers there, right? And how can I use my time, treasure, talent, as I love to say, to align with it? And so you decided with Dick's support and partnership to create something which is so valued and needed. And full disclosure, I chose to invest in Equity Alliance in part because this amazing human and his team, but also just really recognizing the need. So I've been chatting with people around the idea of creating a fund of funds in this space that you're operating in for some time. And lo and behold, we're here today. So, but why this? And maybe talk a little bit what Equity Alliance is, and of all things you could have done, kind of why this structure and the way that you put it together and successfully launched just over a month ago.
Well, to be honest, I was always a media entrepreneur since I was in my early 20s, and that was pretty much the identity that I carried around. That was almost like my calling card. And I launched in another media company in 2015 called True Africa, not True America, but True Africa. And that company started off doing quite well in the beginning in 2015, 16, and 17. And then that digital media company kind of stalled, to be honest, because to make a long story short, when Facebook kind of deprioritized the news, it was much more difficult for digital publishers to have that sort of real estate on Facebook, which was a big driver of our traffic and readership. So that stalled, even though I got funded by Google and was able to keep that going, and it's still going now. But I felt like I already kind of had done what I needed to do in media, and I wanted to do something that would basically help other people and create a much bigger movement through business. And it was not just about reporting on what other people were doing. It was actually getting straight into helping people set up ventures, because I felt that the pandemic was going to lead to a radical transformation of the American economy and actually the world's economy. But I felt that it was time. This was a unique opportunity to help new ventures get off the ground. And in the conversations that I had with Dick Parsons, it just felt that so many people were overlooked. And one of the reasons they were overlooked was because they just couldn't get access to capital. And that is the main problem we're trying to solve, is finding ways to get capital into the hands of women and people of color, people who just find it so much harder. And when we started thinking about this, we always kept going back to this one statistic that is from a study that was commissioned by the Knight Foundation. And that study, which was actually commissioned by the Knight Foundation but produced by the Bella Group in partnership with Harvard Business School, found that the world of asset management is huge. It's a $70 trillion industry. But at that time, when we were talking about it, it was only 1.3% of those assets that were managed by diverse fund managers. And so the fact that diverse-owned firms were managed only at 1.3%, now actually it's gone up to 1.4%, which is great. But it's still a tiny, tiny, tiny number in an industry that is really crucial to the survival of this country. And in a world where America is becoming so stratified, where so many people are getting so rich, and I see so many people really struggling to make ends meet in the way that I once did when I was a young entrepreneur in this city, I felt like I was kind of uniquely positioned to do it. And also by tapping into the network and experience of Dick Parsons, who again rose through the ranks to become one of the most powerful business leaders in America. So we felt that bringing a lot of different talents together, that's what we called it, the Alliance, would be really good, because we would bring different perspectives, different insights to actually helping people who have great ideas for new ventures, but didn't really actually know how to get the capital they need to take off.
Well, and it's interesting when I saw that study, the Knight study, and hopefully Shay can pop it into the chat for us. Very similar motivation for me, actually, with my focus on women and money. When in 2009, I was asking this question too, for me, it was, where are the women in fund management? And I commissioned a research paper called Women in Fund Management, a Roadmap to Critical Mass and Why It Matters, that looked at the landscape of research that might be able, in that time, and I still am to some degree obsessed with research, because I think it helps drive action. It doesn't necessarily create it, but it's a factor. And we, with the help of some others, we looked at all the research that could possibly explain, why so few women and people of color in the fund management business. And of course, there is no good reason. But very similarly, we created a roadmap for change, which sadly at the time, I just didn't feel, I didn't know how to really execute upon it, other than putting a lot of ideas out there. But to your point, this is what was true in 2009 is barely changed today in terms of an industry that doesn't reflect talent and opportunity and the need for capital. So I love that. And I love that you called it the Alliance, because you've actually pulled together quite an exception, not just Dick, who is incredible from what I hear and from you, but an incredible advisory board that's of sorts that are standing along with you. And it seems to me, and which is one of the many reasons I love Equity Alliance, is it's, sorry to say this, but it's not just a fund, right? It's not just a fund of funds. So talk a little bit about sort of the strategy in terms of identifying the funds, maybe even lift up a couple examples, and direct investment. So you are doing both of those, and how you're seeing sort of your, we can get into that too, this leveraging of social capital and this idea of a social capital playbook to bear to try to not only bring capital, but to help ensure that these companies and your fund managers are successful?
So I'm glad you asked me that, because I feel like there's a lot of funds out there, and the world doesn't need another fund. I feel like we weren't going to do this if we didn't feel that we could be truly very differentiated. And the fact that we're an alliance means that we can tap into the expertise of our investors, people like yourself, but we also have people like Scott Kapnick, who runs an $80 billion credit firm called HPS, and he was one of the first investors because, he believes that something needs to be done to really level the playing field. He actually just gave a $10 million gift to Howard University in DC so that they could help to train more Black MBAs at the business school there. And that was a $10 million gift in addition to the investment he made in the equity lines, because he really, truly believes that something needs to happen. Some of your former colleagues, people like Mike Novogratz, and Jacqueline Novogratz, his sister, who was one of the most influential impact investors through the Acumen Fund. They all bring different perspectives. Ken Lehrer, he created the Lehrer Hippo venture capital firm, which is New York's most active early stage VC firm. So we have different people who are at the top of their game in different industries, and I rely on them to help us in terms of strategically positioning ourselves to be truly differentiated. And then my job with my small team is to really go out and identify the very, very, very best fund managers by, again, only picking people who are emerging managers and who are either women or people of color. And so what's happened is we've spoken with over 150 funds, and some people you can tell just at the very beginning of the conversation that they are very much for real and that they really have what I'll just call the measure of the game. And if they've got the measure of the game, it's because they're looking at this changing landscape really objectively, and they don't come with some bogus theory about, oh, I figured out how to, solve the problem of the future of work. They really have real insights into specific change forces within communities that will affect the way people work in the future, right? And so because some of these fund managers that we've invested in were also entrepreneurs and operators, they also understand what it's like to sit at the other side of the table. And I feel like those different perspectives make for much stronger and much more committed fund managers. And so we've made 15 investments so far, and we're really happy with the way that we've been able to allocate capital across three categories. There's the smaller funds, which we've been calling nano funds. Some of them are only raising maybe $5 million or $10 million, and they're having such a hard time raising $5 or $10 million for their fund because they don't really know anyone. And a lot of people won't even consider them just because they've traditionally been overlooked, as I said earlier. And so our job is to understand what their thesis is and how we can help them, not just with capital, but also with what we have been calling the social capital playbook. And I'll get to that. And then there's a second category, which is our core category, who are people who are raising funds between, say, 25 and 60 million. And those are most of the investments we made so far. And those are the ones we understand because we feel like we can really help them to get their foot in the door. And the size of those funds is it feels good for fund one. And we feel like we can support them by introducing them to other people in our network as well. And then there's a larger category of funds that we've invested in. And the reason we've invested in some of those larger funds is because we have got the fund managers to commit to helping the most emerging nano funds. So they help them with things like reserves and allocation and follow-on strategy, a lot of things that you only really learn in this game because, venture capital is a bit of an apprenticeship game, and you need to learn from people who've done it before. And the fact that we get different fund managers to share insights with each other, and for some of the more experienced ones to mentor the more emerging fund managers, we feel is quite differentiated. And that's why when we talk about our social capital playbook, we always talk about it across three pillars. The first pillar is what we call educate. This is how we equip our fund managers and the entrepreneurs they support with the skills that they need to strive and to succeed. And then the second pillar is what we call engage. And that's how we actually provide a platform that helps our fund managers to attract additional investors and partners. So we've been really good at introducing our fund managers and sometimes the startup founders themselves to some of our investors, because we don't believe that all the capital should flow to the Equity Alliance. As an alliance, we want to facilitate access to capital for people within our broader network, and a rising tide will lift all boats. So we're not precious in the way that we believe that all of capital should just come to us. And then the third pillar, Jacki, is what we call Elevate. And this is how we support our fund managers and their startup founders in telling their story and marketing their ventures. Because what I find, as somebody who's spent pretty much my entire adult life in media, mostly promoting women and people of color in media, through Trace and also through True Africa, is sometimes they're a little bit too shy. They're a little bit too shy about their accomplishments because they feel like their accomplishments are not worthy of press. They're not worthy of mentions. And we help them to tell their story in a really authentic way.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, especially your framework around the social capital playbook. And I want to just champion a framework that we talk about, because it's very aligned and very consistent with what you're talking about. And maybe Shay will post this article about it in the chat, but we use this term sistering up. And we came across sistering as a construction term, which kind of means to make stronger. It's almost when they put two, like you can think of a architecture of a building, the framework of a building, joints, like putting it together to make it stronger. And we've created this sort of engagement framework, which I think is actually, just like yours, so helpful, because so often I say, okay, I meet an amazing founder or fund or an author, and I go, what can I do? And then you get all overwhelmed and you can't do everything, but you can do something. And it's sort of this idea of, there's 4 levels: connect, amplify, champion, and partner. And for us, it's like this increasing level of engagement. And I would say, us, She Play, She Money, Jacki, Claude, Equity Alliance is an example of partnering, where you not just, hopefully put in your financial capital, but you really use your social capital. And I feel too, like, to your point, I love that word, let's not make it also precious, and I care deeply, as I know you do, about reputation, and you can't do all things. But I think what the model you're building, and frankly, the model we're trying to build, and is so similar, because we're saying, look, we, for whatever reason, have that social capital as well as access, which is in part access to financial capital. So how do we create an ecosystem? And there's a great map, actually, of the ecosystem to support women entrepreneurs in particular that I posted as well, that some guy, sorry, I can't think of his name right now, generously shared. But this, when I think of getting from less than 2% to what it should be, which is at least something representative of the population, and not be so incremental, it's because the people who have power and resources just hold it too friggin' tightly. And what does it look like to really be so much more generous with all of our resources? And I'm trying to hold myself accountable for that in the model that you're talking about. But I want to press back just a little bit around this, and sort of especially the nano funds question, because I know, with the help of Madison and my team here at She Plays, Rose Masner, we've similarly talked to about 50 funds. Almost all of them, I would say, are in the category of 0 to 50 million. And, it's this idea that, the trajectory of a manager's success is, you spin out, you start your own fund, but, if it's a $5 million fund, and I celebrate your success, and I think you wanted to speak about one of the funds that you invested in, but the economics of that are so horrible. And I struggle with that. And I've invested in small funds before, and if they don't scale and aren't successful in raising their next fund, then that to your point of like this upward trajectory of support, it won't be successful. And what I think is so important right now in this minute, we have, to your point, 150, or at least 50 in the nano, like amazing folks. They might not all be worthy of funding. I'm not trying to judge that, but a lot of them are. And I'm just like you with Equity Alliance, I'm trying to mobilize capital into some of these funds. And I've invested in, a bunch of them: Walkstars, Tracy Gray's 22 Fund, Springbank Collective, Hannah Gray, Metrodora, Another one, Awesome People's Ventures, Audacity Funds. There are these amazing funds that I'm hearing about, and I wish I could invest in all of them in many ways. But this focus on nano funds, like to me, like I get goosies, it's so important for this whole new breed of managers. So can you, sorry to get on my soapbox around this, but can you maybe lift up the example of one of your nano funds that you invested in, and just a little commentary about advice to these smaller funds, in terms of how they can access the capital to get them started, and what they need to know about that journey, knowing that they're in that category of these smaller funds that are really hard to be sustaining in terms of revenue.
Yeah, I'm so passionate about these nano funds because I really admire the way they're able to be so frugal. If you have a $5 million fund, which is the case for a fund we just invested in, it's called Debut Capital, and it's run by a Latina African-American woman called Pilar Johnson and her business partner, Bobak. It's a great fund. They've already invested in a company that already became a unicorn, but they wrote very small checks. And if you look at a $5 million fund, 2% of that is only going to give you 100% in management fees. So how are you going to spread that across two people and pay for everything else that goes into running a fund? But what I do admire about their approach is that because they're frugal, they learn how to do a lot with very little. That's kind of how I've always started all my businesses. I've always liked to start small, almost like proof of concept mentality, learn from mistakes and scale really quickly. That's what worked for me for Trace, and that's what I think what's going to work for us with the Equity Alliance. And that's what I try to teach some of these fund managers, going to my own experience and some of the mistakes I might have made in the past. Is it's good that you're thinking small in the beginning, but remember that only 80% of fund managers 80% of fund managers are never able to raise a fund two. And so if you want to be in the 20% who actually do get to fund two and fund three, that fund one needs to be absolutely perfect. And one way they're doing it is like they have to be so measured and so smart about the way they make these investment decisions. And the fact that they put pressure on themselves means that they have to give themselves space to be lucky in a sense, but they have to be extremely disciplined in the way that they spend each dollar. And I know it's very, very hard, but the discipline that comes with allocating capital when you don't have a lot of capital means that once you actually have more, if you stay frugal and you stay disciplined that way, you can actually create really, really profitable and smart funds. And that's why the way that we work with them is we first look at their thesis. And if I go back to, say, the nano fund that I was just mentioning, Debut Capital, they only invest in Black, Latinx, and Indigenous founders who are kind of shaping what I'm calling and what everybody's been calling our future kind of post-pandemic world. And they have these great companies in their portfolio, but for some reason, despite the fact that they have traction, a lot of people just won't even consider investing in them just because they're so small. And a lot of people feel, I just can't manage so many funds in my portfolio, so that little guys get pushed out. And so our job is to help them to get to their $5 million target, but also to introduce them to people who can help them as they position themselves for fund two. So we're not in this for the short term. We're really looking, to build 10, 15-year relationships with these fund managers and the companies that they back. And that's why, by having this patient approach, I feel like we're going to actually do quite well as a fund as well.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I think it is about being scrappy, but it also is, to your point, just about not only the bias that really shows up. I mean, you can't look at the numbers and say there isn't a lot of bias embedded in systems that allocate capital. You just can't, and so they are sort of fighting against that. And again, I see this as so much as an opportunity. It's not like something I'm trying to do to be nice. Like, I think the companies that investing in these fund managers that in turn are investing in companies often founded by women and people of color that are overlooked and may not be, but are meeting the needs, right, of audience and consumers is so important. But if again, it's this theory of change that we were talking about, Claude, and which I hold true, which is why I focus on identifying funds as well, that if you invest in fund managers of different backgrounds with certain perspectives, they will in turn invest in companies and founders. And so when capital flows here, it's creating wealth, obviously, hopefully over time, and this economic sort of ripple effect or wave that is multi-level, right? It goes, in the fund manager's hands in terms of founders who are more likely to hire employees and build wealth and equity, amongst their communities and their circles of influence that's serving a demographic that hopefully is also connected, which is why they started the company in the first place. So to me, we could talk maybe a little later about sort of philanthropy versus investment. But that's, for me, but having spent a lot of time really focusing on philanthropy, that I think if we want change, we have to be focusing on where's the money? Where's the money?
Yeah.
Who's it going to? How is it being allocated? And I don't think, I don't want to shame people because that's not who I am, but I have to look at myself in the mirror and saying, I have financial resources. How do I use those in alignment with my intention, especially if I'm over here in my little philanthropy chair saying I'm trying to do good in the world? How am I translating that commitment into my investment capital?
Well,
and
yeah.
I think it matters so much.
But I think the way that you position yourself and that we position ourselves is really important as well, because one of the things that I struggled with in the beginning when we were raising the fund is a lot of people just figured that, because we were focusing on women and people of color, we had to be an impact fund. And they were like, you a nonprofit? I was like, no, we're very much a for-profit fund, because we believe that investing in women and people of color is actually good business and will actually lead to very, very profitable companies, and in turn, communities that are a lot more stable and that are actually more prosperous. So it was something that I had to actually educate a lot of very sophisticated investors on. And I didn't believe in the beginning that I would have to go back to that kind of, 101 lesson to be able to tell them how there's a lot of consumers in these changing economies that are going to be looking for new types of companies, and a lot of people who initially had this odds stacked against them could be the ones leading this revolution. And I'll just even use an example of another fund that we invested in, Serena Ventures. A lot of people just don't realize what a great investor Serena Williams is. Serena Williams is known as an athlete, but she's actually a great investor. She's invested in some companies like Ollie. She invested in Masterclass really early on, and we invested in her fund. But one of the things I was looking at when I was comparing her fund with funds that had similar theses but were run by white women, I just felt that the white women were raising a lot more money than she was, even though she had already proven herself in many ways as a winner, right? It doesn't come much more of a winner type A than Serena. However, it was kind of a little bit harder for her than I expected it to be. And that was really a learning moment for me. I said, wow, the race lens is important and the gender lens is important. So that racial lens, that means that Black women get 0.01% of VC funding, is something that we're trying to tackle as well, which is why we've made so many investments in funds that are led by Black women. I mentioned Debut Capital and Serena Ventures, but there's also a fund out of Atlanta called Collab that we invested in. There's another fund also out of Atlanta called Fearless Fund. And these funds are really great, but it's so hard for them to raise money. So this is something we have to tackle. And what I also find, Jackie, going back to one of your earlier points, is I find that a lot of women don't support women. I find a lot of Black people don't support Black people. I find a lot of Latinos don't support Latinos. It's just, they want to be the only one in the room, right? And they don't want to share information because they feel like, if I share access to my LP list, then maybe the money's going to flow to you and not to me. And that mentality has to change. And we're really doing a lot with this alliance model to make sure that people do realize that, as I said earlier, the rising tide of venture capital that we're in now will lift all boats. And this kind of approach, which is much more about being territorial and self-centered, is actually not helping anyone.
Yeah. Well, yes. And, I'll be frank, in my experience, I've been so excited by the generosity in the spaces that with the fund managers I've been dealing with, and especially, and I'm going to look at Matt here for a minute, but the Tracy, for example, Tracy Gray, we had a LinkedIn Live with the 22 fund, and yes. Gayla Jennings, they formed, what's it called again? the collaborative of funds that are in it together. She's going to look it up and post it in the chat. But,
Yeah.
these, and Tracy in particular, I just want, I think you know her, Claude, right?
I do. And I know about the collaborative, and it's great.
Yeah.
And I've been very supportive of what they're doing.
But, to your point, what you're saying, you're spending a lot of your time educating. And, to even trace it back to my Goldman experience, like, and I've had so many interesting discussions with people actually around Sundance. I had a great group of folks at our table. We were talking about this exact issue, is how much, if you're a champion, as a woman in a predominantly male environment, as a person of color in a predominantly white environment, if you're at that table, how much time it takes and and expectations perhaps to take on that education piece and to, create, I guess, just more opportunity for folks. And, again, that's what I feel like if I look back on my life and career, especially at Goldman, that's what I hold is something that I felt really responsible for. And yet at some point you're like, come on, people, it should be on all of us to do our own education and to create our own accountability. But, this idea of, leaning away from scarcity and abundance is really important, and sharing as you are and we are, like, resources. So I'm curious about that, as you move forward, you say you've vetted all of these funds, you're choosing to invest in a handful, and I apologize if I should have looked on your website to see if you're publishing that. But to the point of, like, how are you, or how do you see the ecosystem in terms of already your experience, such that, you choose to invest in a fund? How are you amplifying that out, and directs? Like, talk a little bit more about this sort of ecosystem of social capital that I think we're both trying to create together, because I want to do more of that as well. And what's needed to, bring more folks into this space to, invest in these funds, all the way from nano on up. And obviously the underlying companies as well.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked me about that, Jackie, because I want to be able to talk about specific examples of things that we feel we've done well. And I'm not going to be modest here. I'm going to start by saying that I feel kind of uniquely qualified to do this because, again, I've spent my entire adult life in this space. So I have my coffee here too. So
At 9:30, I'm like, we have this amazing cup of coffee, and it's like a white espresso lavender oat milk latte, and it's like, drink me. So I have
No, well, yeah, I mean, it's really important because the first fund we invested in, it's called Concrete Rose Capital. They're based in Silicon Valley, and it's run by a fund manager called Sean Mendy. And Sean was kind of born and raised in the San Francisco area, and he knows the Valley really well. And as a Black fund manager, he grew up with a lot of people who were the children of the captains of the new Silicon Valley industry, these mega companies that came out of Silicon Valley, and he saw it on both sides of the tracks. And what was interesting about his fund is that he has a really great relationship with a lot of really good companies that a lot of people haven't heard of. So he invested in a company called Isuzu. And again, Concrete Rose was our first investment. And a couple months after we invested in Concrete Rose, we also invested in Serena Ventures that I mentioned. And then we found out that Serena Ventures also invested in Isuzu. So that was an interesting data point for us because we're like, oh, wow, how interesting. This fintech that was created by a Nigerian American entrepreneur who came as an immigrant, and with his best friend and business partner, who's an Indian American entrepreneur who came to America as an immigrant, and they're solving a problem which is so important for communities everywhere in America. And they're basically allowing renters who pay their rent on time to report their on-time rent payments to the credit bureaus, and that helps to build their credit. And they're also, at the same time, servicing landlords who now have more stability and are able to spot and actually help the people who are struggling in these very, very difficult times we're in. So it's a great model. It sounds like a very, very simple idea, but the fact that these guys just seem to be so real, so authentic, so dedicated, so hardworking, and that they were vetted by Serena Ventures that were vetted by Concrete Rose meant that we had an opportunity to make a direct investment in that company, Isuzu, back in July of 2021, which now seems like a really long time ago. But we invested in their Series A. They were raising $10 million. And actually, Jacqueline Novogratz, one of our LPs, was one of the very first investors in that company. And I just could see that this company was going to be great. And actually, one of our investment committee members, Will Mesdag, another one of your former colleagues from Goldman Sachs, the partners, he said this company is going to return the whole fund. And it turns out last week it was announced.
Something just happened. Just let him know. Claude, I think you muted yourself accidentally. Oh, there you are.
Oh, where did I stop? Where did I stop?
A second ago, you were saying about another investor. You were talking about Isuzu.
Yeah, so Isuzu, just last week was announced in TechCrunch and then everywhere in the press that they had just raised their Series B, which we participated in as well. And they raised $130 million Series B. And that round was led by SoftBank, and the valuation was $1 billion. So that's our first unicorn, hopefully the first of many. But it's not just about the fact that our first direct investment ended up being a unicorn within 6 months. It's much more about the fact that that specific unicorn is going to help millions of Americans, of immigrants across the country to build their credit and actually hopefully get on that property ladder and become owners themselves, access to credit, access to mortgages, and so on. And so people forget how a lot of people feel left out of this economy, even though all the numbers are saying that the economy is doing really well and that there's huge growth. There's still a lot of people who are still in the margins and just don't feel like they're part of this new wave of prosperity. And fintechs and new companies like Isuzu, and I believe there's going to be dozens of them, they will actually help to change society. And I believe that we need to be at the forefront of that by getting the real insights and the real intros from our fund managers and helping these managers to support them. And we actually in turn invest in some of the companies and introduce them to some of our LPs. So for instance, the co-founder of Isuzu, Abi Wemimo, I introduced him to one of our LPs, Ed Matthias, and his wife, Dale Matthias. And Ed is a co-founder of the Carlyle Group. And then Ed and Dale ended up investing in Isuzu in that Series A that we were part of. And then they introduced him to a bunch of other people. And we believe that that kind of social capital will ultimately lead to economic capital, right? Because what I found in my generation of entrepreneurs is a lot of us, didn't make as much money as we felt that we should have. And a lot of us have a lot of social capital, but we don't necessarily have the economic capital that we feel that we deserve, given what we contributed to the economy. And as a result, what we're working on with one of our board members, who's actually a professor at MIT, she's an African-American professor from Brooklyn, and she studies social capital at MIT, and she is helping us to quantify the ways in which social capital can turn into economic capital. Because that, I believe, is how we will create generational wealth. And that's going to be a really important kind of litmus test for success in the future.
I love that. And actually, I'll have to introduce you. My brother-in-law is a professor, Robert Cross, who writes a lot of books. I think, right now he's at Babson. I think yes, he is. But he wrote this book, Informal Power. I think it's Informal, looking at my book stack of social networks. But for decades, he created these, and he has software around sort of looking within organizations, where is that social capital held? And I think it's interesting that you say that, because in so many levels, one, I just would love to meet her, because I think that social capital, and I'm curious about your thoughts too, as we move into this world of Web 3.0 and DAOs and all these ways that we're trying to monetize social capital in a way that is wealth creating. And and I both know Eric, who founded Audacity Fund. We've spoken about this, creating, when you show up with your voice, with your Twitter, with your Instagram, with your purchasing power, it's still so one-sided, right? You're building, you lend all of this to, or give it to, a company or a person, a celebrity or whatever, but there's, there's not a way, I mean, I guess with Instagram now, with influencers, it's just starting, that whole business model is getting monetized. But I'm not so much talking about becoming an influencer and getting paid by advertising, but this idea of like, I love how you said that the process of converting social capital into real economic capital is happening. And I'm curious if you're also within funds, which is what I'm fascinated with right now as well, sort of looking in this crypto, blockchain, Web 3.0 DAO space, and if you have intention to build and invest in that area, and whether or not, even from an ecosystem perspective, could that be a solution in terms of how we form communities of like intention to create a support system. And there's one being launched in Switzerland right now, a DAO associated with a token and a potential venture fund, like these new models that might actually provide ways to do exactly what you're saying in ways that haven't been done before.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned crypto, but I want to come to crypto after we talk about social capital, because I feel like, again, because that really is our special sauce, and that really is how we feel that we're gonna differentiate ourselves in the marketplace. I want to take it back to one of the things I alluded to in the discussion, in our interview that was published on LinkedIn, is we want to take it back to the social capital theory and the fact that it was defined by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and that was in the 1980s. He wrote about how certain people are able to amass so many resources, and these resources are linked to the fact that they have a great network, and they have great networks that are linked to institutionalized relationships, and people recognize them as being leaders or experts or really, really great at what they do. And a lot of those networks come from family networks, school networks, and so on. And the people that we've been helping, they didn't all go to MIT like I did. They didn't all get funded by Goldman Sachs like I did. They didn't necessarily have access to certain networks, and we're hoping to provide them with that network. And once they have that network, to make the most of it so that they can actually create capital for their families and for entire communities. That really is really important to us, because again, it hasn't happened before. In the time that I was running my media company Trace, and I was kind of reporting a lot of rappers and musicians and so on, a lot of rappers, I was just really shocked to see how they were so famous, but they didn't actually have any money. They didn't actually even own a house sometimes. And they lost the money because of financial literacy issues and all that. And those are things that were helping them, a lot of our fund managers and the entrepreneurs they support on the, on the social capital playbook front. But then to go back to crypto, we made an investment in a fund called Vault Capital. And Vault Capital, that was our first kind of crypto-focused fund investment. And Vault Capital is run by Sunam Haas. She is a Lebanese-American fund manager. She's so smart. She's hiring right now, and she's she's really become a bit of a thought leader and looking at these equity deals in crypto. So she raised a $10 million debut a venture fund that did really, really well. And through her, we're getting schooled on the potential with DAOs and everything that's happening in the crypto world, because she started her fund having published a really influential newsletter when she was, I think 20 years old. So she really has been in this game for a while. And I feel like she brings a really fresh approach to looking at the potential of crypto and how it's game changing across the board. And then the other thing I'll say is one of our founding investors, Mike Novogratz, has become one of the major thought leaders and investors and big time players in the world of crypto through his firm Galaxy Digital, which has become a bit of an arbiter in the space of crypto right now. And Mike Novogratz, who again was another Goldman Sachs partner who went on to lead the hedge fund business at Fortress, he kind of reinvented himself as this kind of crypto evangelist who just keeps winning in crypto. And so we are able to have people like that as founding investors. So on crypto, we can tap into the expertise and this major network that Mike Novogratz has been able to build around his being a bit of a maven in the world of crypto.
Yeah, I used to actually work with Mike way back
Oh,
when
okay.
we were Goldman at the same time. My husband too.
Okay. small
I
world.
know.
Worlds are so, yeah, it's convergence on so many levels, right?
I know. And I just want to just acknowledge sort of the chat and what's showing up there. And thank you so many, Amy Cross, others. I see Pamela. If you have questions, we'll try to get to them. If you do post them, in the chat,
Before we
please.
get to questions, though, I do want to also kind of mention one quick thing about how we were introduced, and that happened through Hannah Gray, because Kate, who's one of the founders of Hannah Gray, she used to work with Lara Hippo. Lara Hippo is one of the founding investors in the Equity Alliance, and she introduced us, and now we're looking at investing in them. And again, they bring the spirit of generosity. You invested in Hannah Gray, but now we're looking at investing in them, and we're sharing information on deals. And I think that that's the way that we have to collaborate in the future. And that's why I keep insisting on the fact that the alliance is at the core positioning of our DNA.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I love Jessica and Kate, that are part of Hannah Gray. And I mean, as an example of just showing up so generously, and just amazing fund managers too, and how they run their fund is just extraordinary. But to your point, like there's these layers of fund managers and then all the companies that they're investing in, right? And to build, what I love too about the Equity Alliance model is because you have different sides of funds that are able to do, seed and pre-seed all the way up. Because, as I'm learning, as my portfolio, I have about 20 direct investments myself, as well as all the funds. And in trying to champion these, the companies as they go up from pre-seed, seed A, B, those relationships, like it's a whole trajectory. You can't, it's not just a one stop, you're done, right? Like whether it be the fund or the founder and the company, they're looking for more capital. They're looking for access to companies so they can pitch, et cetera. And I just wanted to give just before I'm looking for questions, but just I was meant to say it earlier about Serena Williams and people not knowing what a great investor she is, and just the spirit of generosity that Whitney Hurd, who obviously is founder of Bumble, and Serena, this was a couple of years ago, right pre-pandemic, actually, and this is just so generous and interesting and amazing, like called people, hosted an event in California where they invited funders, fund managers, so individual investors, fund managers, relative and founders, very successful founders like I think Away, the founder of Away Bags, and so many others, and some folks looking for funding, all together in a space. And it wasn't like really a lot of programming. It was just meet and talk and have shared experience and learn each other's stories. And it was there that I learned of a company called Translator Inc., which was founded by Natalie Egan, a transgender woman, which is in the D&I space, doing D&I software. And, I never would have met her and heard about this company had it not been through the intention of Whitney and Serena Williams to just bring people together and say, meet each other. And, and then again, things go from there. So I had the opportunity, to meet Serena and Whitney both. And, they're just doing so much in this space, and they're putting their money where their values are. So I just wanted to double down on that shout out, because they are quite incredible. Okay, so we have just 5 more minutes, Claude. And, I think just to wrap up the conversation a little bit, so what is, and you wrote about this, you responded to this question in the article a little bit, but for you, what does success look like for Equity Alliance, or if you're imagining a future for us together in terms of, where success of Equity Alliance is social transformation, and let's be so bold as to invite that in to this space today. What does that look like for you?
Well, for us, success is the ability to scale. And to scale, that means that we want to be in that 20% of funds who actually raise a fund 2 and a fund 3 and a fund 4. And that means that perhaps over the next 10 to 15 years, we may be able to deploy up to $1 billion in this space of kind of helping and supporting and engaging with women and people of color who are either fund managers or early stage venture founders. That's really what we see as success. And our success is basically defined by the success of the people that we support. And we don't necessarily see ourselves being in a silo where it's all about us. Again, by definition, being an alliance, if we see thousands and thousands of jobs created, hundreds of communities across America being transformed with this capital, and more institutional investors, big endowments, kind of supporting what we do, we will feel that we've actually moved the needle, and that maybe that number, which is currently sitting at 1.4% of assets that are managed by diverse fund managers, maybe one day it'll be 2%, right? So even just moving it from 1.4% to 2% is real success. So if we can be part of that movement that is about moving that needle, I feel like we'll have done really well, because right now we've got institutional investors like Bank of America, we have Ford Foundation supporting us, a lot of big names, but there's a lot more that we can do once we start tapping into capital across America to be able to funnel this capital into the hands of the people who actually really need it and felt like they were left out all these years.
Well, thank you. I mean, I kind of want that number to be closer to 25, 30, 40, 50%, but, and truly, I mean, it's, and truly, because this is opportunity to invest in the future and the world that we want to live in, so, I know you're kind of right there with me, and I'm all about realistic goals, but, I'm kind of fiercely on this, path with you, because, and again, I look at my portfolio of funds and companies, and I look at what they're doing, in the world. Hello Alice, just building, just in terms of what they're doing to bring resources to start up businesses, and just a new one, Lead to Health, that's working to provide services for victims of sexual assault. And these are much needed companies, by founders who understand the space that they're working in, and are creating products and services, for folks that that need these products and services. I don't know. I just see it as such an opportunity. So with that, I just want to say, Claude, thank you for being here. If you haven't read the article yet, please go over the She Money newsletter. Please subscribe to it. We also have a YouTube channel. I never might say that out loud. I think we have 4 people. Do we have 8 people? We have 10 people. Yes. Started. But Claude, we're in it with you, and just champion you and Adam and your team and everything that you're doing at Equity Alliance. And do you want to tell us why? We're going to play this Massive Attack song on the way out, but you suggested this song. Tell us your love of this song. Why this one for you?
I love this song because I was a 20-year-old student studying at Sciences Po in Paris, one of those elite universities in Paris. And it was the Gulf War, and the band Massive Attack had changed their name from Massive Attack to Massive because they didn't want to have the word attack in their name. And they released this album called Blue Lines. And it came out of Bristol, and they were kind of spending time between Bristol and London. And I literally made a decision to move to London at age 20 and go study at London University, because I wanted to be close to that energy, because it was the creative energy that ended up being one of the best decisions I ever made. Because in London, I became a journalist and a magazine editor and publisher. And then I was on my way to starting a media company, but I wanted to be right in the center of gravity in London before I came to the real center of gravity, which is New York.
Well, this is my new favorite song. Maddie's digging it too. So we're going to turn it on, and thank you for joining us. And thank you for everyone who joined us.